On May 9, 2015, the entire world was glued to television screens. The reason was not another Hollywood blockbuster, but the rehearsal for the Victory Day parade in Moscow. Moving across the cobblestones of Red Square was a vehicle that, until that moment, no one outside of secret design bureaus had seen. A massive, low-slung hull, a turret of an unusual shape without a single hatch on top, and a silhouette that resembled no other tank in the world. This was the Armata, the newest Russian tank. On that day, it caused generals on both sides of the ocean to grab their phones. A few hours later, true chaos reigned at NATO headquarters in Brussels because intelligence monitor screens displayed a vehicle whose characteristics did not fit into any forecast by Western analysts. Then, something happened that absolutely no one expected. During the dress rehearsal of the parade, one of the Armata tanks suddenly froze right in the middle of Red Square. The vehicle stood motionless, and not a single crew member could make it move. World television channels immediately picked up the story, and headlines were filled with snide comments about how the Russian supertank turned out to be nothing but a heavy pile of metal incapable of even driving on a flat road. Western journalists competed to write about the failure of the Russian defense complex, about Potemkin villages and window dressing. But the truth, as often happens, turned out to be much more prosaic and simultaneously more amusing. The tank did not break down. The young driver mechanic sitting at the controls of this ultra-modern machine simply accidentally pressed the emergency brake. The system worked exactly as designed, instantly locking the chassis. After 15 minutes, the crew resolved the situation, and the Armata left the square under its own power. However, those 15 minutes traveled around the globe and forever stuck to the tank's reputation. This incident on Red Square actually became a symbol of the entire history of the Armata, because from the very first day, such a cloud of propaganda, speculation, and outright lies from both sides swirled around this vehicle that it became practically impossible to distinguish truth from fiction. Some shouted that it was the best tank in human history, others claimed it was a mock-up on tracks, and the truth, as usual, was hidden somewhere in the middle. To understand where the Armata came from and why it produced such a bombshell effect, one must go back several years. In 2010, the Ministry of Defense of Russia made a decision that changed the entire landscape of global tank building. The military closed a project named Object 195, better known as the T-95, a promising tank that had been under development since the mid-90s. Colossal funds and years of work by the country's best engineers had been spent on this project, but it never reached mass production. However, Russian designers acted very wisely and with great foresight. Instead of burying all the developments along with the project, they transferred key technologies to a completely new program. A powerful engine, an unmanned turret, reinforced armor, and dozens of other technical solutions that had been perfected for years on the T-95 became the basis for a fundamentally new tank. The development task was given to Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil, and the deadlines were tight. The vehicle was supposed to go onto the assembly line by 2015. Uralvagonzavod was not a random choice, because this giant of the defense industry carried a heritage rooted in the most difficult years of history. It was here, in the Urals, during the years of the Great Patriotic War, that the weapons of victory were forged. The plant produced legendary T-34s by the thousands, and these machines turned the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. Now, the descendants of those very engineers and workers faced a task no less ambitious: to create a tank for the 21st century that would make the whole world reckon with Russia. The designers proposed an idea that was so bold that many specialists initially tapped their temples. They decided to create not just a tank, but a universal tracked platform upon which they could build the tank itself, a heavy infantry fighting vehicle, self-propelled artillery, and a recovery vehicle. A single chassis for an entire family of armored vehicles would mean colossal savings in production, maintenance, and crew training. This was a revolutionary decision, and, what was particularly satisfying, the Americans had tried to implement a similar concept in their program to replace the Abrams back in the early 2000s, but their project failed miserably without even leaving the prototype stage. Russian engineers, however, brought their idea to a working machine that drove out onto Red Square in that very year of 2015, causing NATO generals to nervously reach for their safes containing secret documents. The main trump card of the Armata, the very element that made Western experts truly nervous, was its turret. More precisely, the fact that there was not a single person inside this turret. For the first time in the history of world tank building, a mass-produced combat vehicle received a fully unmanned combat module, controlled remotely, with an armored capsule in the front part of the hull. All three crew members, the commander, the gunner, and the driver mechanic, sat side by side in an isolated compartment separated from the turret and ammunition by the most powerful armor. This meant that even if an enemy shell penetrated the turret, the crew would remain alive and could continue the fight. No other tank in the world could offer this. It was this decision that overturned all notions of what a modern tank should be. Interestingly, the idea of an unmanned turret had been in the air long before the Armata. Back in the 80s, the Americans experimented with an Abrams prototype on which they installed a remotely controlled turret with an autoloader and a crew of 3 in a protected compartment. The design was strikingly similar to what Russian engineers realized 30 years later. But the American prototype remained an experiment, while Russia turned this concept into a real combat vehicle. However, in fairness, the Russians once borrowed the concept of an infantry fighting vehicle from the Americans, so in tank building, borrowing ideas is a long and perfectly fair tradition. The unmanned turret gave designers another critical advantage. Inside, space was freed up for a powerful autoloader. This system automatically feeds heavy shells weighing more than 20 kilograms each into the breech of the gun without human intervention. On the Abrams, this work is performed by a 4th crew member, the loader, who manually grabs the ammunition and rams it into the barrel. The Russian autoloader delivers 10 to 12 rounds per minute, which roughly corresponds to the rate of fire of an American tank with a live loader. But the machine has one undeniable advantage over a human. It does not get tired, does not panic under fire, and can maintain this pace for hours. Furthermore, the autoloader allowed for the use of increased-size unitary ammunition instead of old 2-component rounds, which seriously increased armor penetration. The heart of the Armata's firepower was the newest smoothbore gun of 125mm caliber with a barrel length of 7 meters. The muzzle energy of this gun exceeded the best NATO tank gun installed on the German Leopard of the 2nd generation by 17%. Accuracy of fire increased by 20% compared to previous systems. Armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot shells accelerated to speeds exceeding 2,000 meters per second. The maximum effective firing range for armor-piercing shells was 4.7 kilometers, and the new ammunition was capable of penetrating 1,000 millimeters of homogeneous rolled armor at a distance of 2 kilometers. The full ammunition load was 45 rounds, which is 10 more than the Abrams. But the real surprise was the Sprinter-guided missile, which could be launched directly through the barrel of the main gun. This anti-tank missile had a claimed destruction range of 8 kilometers, although the real ceiling was limited to 7.5 kilometers because the tank's laser rangefinder could not physically lock onto a target at a greater distance. A ballistic computer is not capable of calculating a fire solution for something it cannot see. This was a perfectly logical limitation. Nevertheless, even 7.5 kilometers is a colossal distance for a tank battle, at which most enemy vehicles would not even understand where the strike came from. The gun was linked to a radar target tracking system that automatically calculated firing parameters for each detected target. The general director of Rostec, Sergei Chemezov, stated that the Armata crew does not need to aim precisely. It is enough to roughly point the gun at the target, and the electronics will do the rest, accurately determining the distance and adjusting the barrel. According to him, the machine used elements of artificial intelligence to assist the crew in firing. This sounded impressive, but Western analysts found a serious counter-argument. The gunner's optical sight on the Armata had a maximum magnification of only 12 times, whereas on the Abrams, this figure reached 50 times, which gave the American tank significantly better resolution, color rendering, and laser rangefinder distance. Historically, the Russian army lagged behind the American army by about a decade in the field of thermal imaging sights and firing efficiency on the move. However, tank battles at distances exceeding 5 kilometers are extremely rare in real combat conditions. Therefore, this advantage of the Abrams was of theoretical rather than practical significance. In addition to the main gun, a heavy machine gun of 12.7 millimeter caliber with an ammunition supply of 300 rounds was placed on the turret roof, designed for fighting infantry and drones. The machine gun was mounted on the commander's optical sight, which worked independently of the main gun, and this gave the tank the ability to simultaneously fire at 2 different targets. The commander could seek out and destroy one threat while the gunner worked on another, and they could instantly pass target designations to each other, swiveling the turret toward a newly discovered enemy. Russian military sources claimed that this heavy machine gun was connected to the tank's radar system and could shoot down incoming rocket-propelled grenades. This sounded almost like science fiction, but if it were true, then the Armata received another level of protection that competitors could only dream of. If the Armata's firepower made Western generals nervous, its protection system gave them a real headache. Russian engineers built 4 echelons of defense, each of which worked independently of the others. To destroy this machine, an opponent had to overcome them all. No tank in the world at that moment possessed such a multi-layered and well-thought-out architecture for survival on the battlefield. The first line of defense began working even before the enemy detected the tank at all. The hull and turret of the Armata were covered with a special compound called Galact, which radically reduced the vehicle's visibility in the infrared and radar ranges. A Russian citizen filmed the Armata with a thermal imaging camera right on the street, and the recording clearly showed that the vehicle practically blended into the background. The only point giving away the presence of the multi-ton tank was a hot spot near the exhaust vent in the rear. For an opponent, this meant that detecting the Armata with a thermal sight from a long distance became significantly more difficult. In modern combat, where the first one detected is the first one destroyed, this advantage was worth a great deal. But if an opponent still managed to spot the machine and fire a shell or missile at it, the second echelon of defense came into play, and it became a true sensation. The Afghanit Active Protection System was a system that automatically tracked incoming munitions and destroyed them on approach. Western experts compared the Afghanit to the famous Israeli trophy system. However, the Russian development claimed to achieve what no active protection complex in the world had managed, intercepting not only missiles and grenades, but also incoming tank shells. The principle of the Afghanit's operation differed from its competitors because the system launched what is called an explosively formed penetrator, formed by a special munition, toward the threat. This approach worked better against small, fast-flying objects like tank shells, but required a significantly more accurate calculation of the intercept trajectory. The ballistic computer tracking the incoming munition had a minimal margin for error, and the slightest miscalculation meant a miss. At the level of soft countermeasures, the Armata used powerful infrared jammers and an automatic system for launching smoke munitions capable of diverting incoming guided missiles, such as the American Javelin. The smoke screen was deployed instantly and automatically without crew intervention based on signals from onboard laser warning sensors. The third line of defense was the new generation Malachit dynamic protection. Previous versions of dynamic protection reduced the penetration of an incoming munition by about 50%. Malachite consisted of blocks with built-in explosives integrated into a single network with sensors that detected the approach of a missile and detonated the charge at a precisely calculated moment. The explosion occurred toward the incoming munition, destroying its cumulative jet or knocking the armor-piercing core off its trajectory before it reached the main armor. The Americans, in response to previous generations of dynamic protection, modernized their Tau anti-tank missiles by equipping them with a tandem warhead with 2 charges, so that the first charge initiated the triggering of the dynamic protection and the second penetrated the already exposed armor. Malachite was the Russian engineers' answer to this threat. But even if by some miracle a munition overcame all 3 previous echelons, it was met by the main hull armor made of a fundamentally new steel grade called 44S, specifically developed for the Armata. This steel allowed for a reduction in the mass of the armored hull by hundreds of kilograms while maintaining protective characteristics, making the machine 15% lighter than it would have been using traditional materials. In addition to steel, the hull included layers of titanium alloy, carbon nanotubes, textilite, ceramic inserts, and air cavities. An incoming shell had to penetrate this entire layered cake, and each new layer took away its energy and changed its trajectory. Separately, it is worth noting that the unmanned turret was itself an element of crew protection. Since there were no people inside the turret, it could be more compact and presented a smaller target. Experienced tankers understood that in a battle against the Armata, the most vulnerable spot was the turret because its armor was thinner, and a hit there could disable the cameras and sighting devices, effectively blinding the crew. Russian military analyst Oleg Faleshnaya explicitly pointed out this vulnerability, noting that the armored capsule with the crew cannot be rotated like a turret. All situational awareness of the crew depends on optical devices and electronics, which can fail in battle. In addition to armor and armament, any tank must be able to move quickly across the battlefield. In this regard, the Armata's designers built capabilities into the machine that surprised even seasoned specialists. In the rear compartment of the tank, a turbo diesel engine A85-3A with a power of 1,500 horsepower was placed. It was this unit that turned the Armata into one of the most mobile heavy combat vehicles on the planet. The secret lay in the power-to-weight ratio, because with a combat weight of about 48 tons, the tank received an exceptionally high specific power indicator of about 31 horsepower per ton of mass. For comparison, the American Abrams weighed almost 20 tons more with a similar power plant output. This difference in mass gave the Armata a noticeable advantage in speed, allowing it to accelerate on the highway to 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, whereas the Abrams was limited to about 67. The claimed cruising range on the road was over 500 kilometers, allowing for long marches without refueling. The small weight of the Armata by the standards of modern main combat tanks was a direct consequence of the unmanned turret and new hull materials. Every kilogram saved meant greater speed, lower fuel consumption, and the ability to cross bridges with limited load capacity that would be impassable for heavier machines. On rugged terrain, in mud, and on inclines, this advantage became even more noticeable because the engine had to pull less mass through every obstacle. But Russian engineers looked further than just speed and cruising range. From the very beginning of the design process, systems were built into the Armata, allowing the tank to be controlled remotely without a crew inside. The unmanned turret, which was already controlled by electronics from the armored capsule, was the perfect starting point for the transition to fully robotic control. It was planned that in the future, an operator could lead a battle while being at a safe distance from the machine, and the tank would carry out his commands on the battlefield independently. This was not science fiction, but a very specific engineering task to which the entire electronic architecture of the machine was adapted. Many NATO tanks, whose hulls and systems were designed back in the 70s during the Cold War, physically could not support such remote control technologies without a complete redesign. This gave Russia a serious advantage in the race for the tank of the future. Then, the Armata went where theories are tested by practice, to war. Russia sent several vehicles to Syria, and this move caused a storm of discussion among military analysts worldwide. Official Russian press releases were drafted deliberately vaguely, leaving room for interpretation. The wording was such that it was impossible to unequivocally understand whether the Armata directly participated in combat engagements or simply underwent testing in conditions close to combat. Western analysts were inclined to believe that Russia pursued several goals at once. First, to obtain real data on the operation of all the tank's systems in conditions of a hot climate, desert dust, and a real theater of military operations. The head of the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Denis Manturov, confirmed that the tanks were sent to Syria to account for all nuances in combat conditions and to form the final look of the vehicle. Second, and no less important, the very fact of the Armata's presence in a conflict zone became a powerful marketing move. Russia was actively offering the Armata for export, and the ability to tell potential buyers that the tank had undergone its baptism of fire in Syria increased its attractiveness on the international arms market many times over. Parallel to the Syrian tests, Russian designers worked on an even more formidable version of the machine. A gun of 152mm caliber with a barrel length of more than 7 meters was under development, which was to become the largest caliber tank gun ever installed on a mass-produced combat vehicle. The universal platform of the Armata allowed for the relatively easy integration of this monstrous gun, whereas competitors would have to design the turret and hull almost from scratch to install such weaponry. NATO, learning of these plans, did not stand aside and began to force its own developments of increased caliber guns of 140mm to somehow respond to the growing threat. One Russian tank had not even stood on the assembly line yet and was already forcing an entire military bloc to spend billions on response measures. But behind all these impressive characteristics, combat tests, and ambitious modernization plans lay a problem that threatened to bury the entire project. It was not related to engineering or design flaws, but to something no military program in the world can exist without: money. When representatives of Uralvagonzavod gave their first interviews after the Armata's premiere in 2015, they voiced a figure that made military experts worldwide catch their breath. By 2020, it was planned to produce 2,300 tanks, which would allow for the replacement of approximately 80% of the vehicles in the leading units of the Russian army. The plan sounded ambitious, daring, and, as it turned out later, completely detached from reality. The project started in 2010, when the Russian economy was experiencing a period of rapid growth. The state treasury was filled with petrodollars, and it seemed that any defense programs were within the country's power. But the situation began to change rapidly, and with it, the fate of the most technologically advanced Russian tank changed as well. The first alarming signals appeared when the real cost of one vehicle became known. Public estimates of the price per unit varied colossally, from $3.8 to $9.5 million. Moreover, most independent experts leaned toward the upper limit of this range. Just for the creation of the production line and the preparation of factory capacities by 2015, $17 million had been spent. These sums clearly demonstrated that Russia truly intended to produce the Armata serially and was not trying to deceive the West with a cardboard mock-up on tracks. As some particularly skeptical Western commentators claimed, real money was invested, factory workshops were re-equipped, and technological chains were built. But the cost of each tank turned out to be significantly higher than the military had calculated. Alexander Sharon, first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, publicly acknowledged the scale of the problem. According to him, at first the machine looked more than innovative and caused an explosion of interest, but it turned out to be prohibitively expensive. The Ministry of Defense concluded that forcing the purchase of large batches of Armata at this stage was inexpedient. Then a true carousel began, which continued for several years and completely confused all observers. In 2016, just a year after the pompous premiere, cheerful reports appeared in the press that mass production of the Armata had been launched. Tank enthusiasts around the world took heart, but the joy turned out to be premature because in 2018, the Russian military abruptly changed course and announced that mass production was being postponed, and instead, the Army would focus on modernizing already existing T-80 and T-90 tanks. The decision was pragmatic. Why spend colossal funds on the production of a completely new platform when it is significantly cheaper to bring thousands of vehicles already in parks and storage bases to a modern level? It seemed that the Armata would remain a unique exhibit for parades and exhibitions. But in 2022, Russia again surprised the world by announcing the start of mass production. Over several years, Uralvagonzavod managed to produce only about 100 machines, which was infinitely far from the original plans of 2,300 units. But the very fact of resuming the series said that no one intended to abandon the project. The history of the Armata is noteworthy because its main competitor across the ocean was in an even more deplorable state. The American program to create a replacement for the Abrams under the designation XM-1202 passed through various stages of development and cancellation for more than 2 decades and never even reached the stage of a working prototype. The Americans could not criticize the Russians for delays in mass production when they themselves could not even build an experimental model that could be shown to the public. The Armata, with all its production problems, at least existed in metal, drove, shot, and underwent tests in real conditions. It was precisely this that constituted the main value of the entire project for the Russian army. Even if the Armata never reaches the level of mass production in the thousands, it has already fulfilled several strategic tasks. The machine became a testing ground for next-generation technologies: unmanned turrets, robotic control, new protection systems, and armaments. Each of these technologies could be transferred to cheaper platforms or implemented during the modernization of existing tanks. Furthermore, the Armata forced the entire Western world to reconsider its tank programs and begin spending billions on the development of response measures. This was also a victory, perhaps not on the battlefield, but in the offices of military budgets.